Imagine being so desperate for a way out of poverty that you make a decision you never thought you would, marrying someone not for love, but for survival. This is the story of Daniel, a 24-year-old college student struggling to afford even a single meal a day. His life was a cycle of unpaid bills, sleepless nights, and an endless fear of failure. But then, an opportunity presented itself, one that seemed too good to ignore. Daniel had always believed that hard work would eventually pay off, but reality had a cruel way of proving him wrong. His mother had passed away when he was just a child, and his father had walked out on him before he even turned 10. He had spent most of his life in foster care, bouncing from one temporary home to another, never really belonging anywhere. When he finally aged out of the system, he found himself completely alone, with no family, no support, and no backup plan. College was his only hope, but even that was slipping away. His part-time job as a dishwasher barely covered rent, let alone tuition. He was drowning in debt, and his landlord had already given him a final warning. He had exhausted every option, except one. One evening, as Daniel scrolled mindlessly through online forums, he stumbled upon a post that caught his attention. Elderly woman looking for genuine companion, financial security guaranteed. The words seemed too direct, too transactional, but they lingered in his mind. He clicked on it, half out of curiosity and half out of desperation. The woman's name was Margaret. Margaret was 75, a wealthy widow who had lost her husband years ago. She had no children, no family, and was simply looking for someone to spend time with. At least, that's how the ad phrased it. But Daniel knew what it really meant. For hours, he debated with himself. Could he really do this? Marry a woman over 3 times his age just for financial stability? It felt wrong, yet the thought of homelessness felt worse. That night, Daniel barely slept. The next morning, he made his decision. He responded to the ad. Their first meeting was in an upscale restaurant, one that Daniel would never be able to afford on his own. Margaret was elegant, poised, and shockingly sharp for her age. She smiled as she sipped her tea, her piercing blue eyes studying him carefully. "You're younger than I expected," she said, with a small smile. Daniel forced a chuckle. "And you're wealthier than I expected." Margaret laughed, a genuine hearty laugh that made him uneasy. "Honesty, I like that." They talked for hours. Surprisingly, Margaret didn't seem like a frail old woman in need of companionship. She was confident, witty, and far more aware of the world than Daniel had assumed. And yet, the offer remained the same. If he agreed to marry her, all of his financial problems would disappear. No debts, no more working long shifts, just to survive. A life of comfort, if only he played the role of a devoted husband. That night, Daniel signed the papers. The wedding was small, almost secretive. No family, no friends, just a judge, 2 witnesses, and the contract that bound them together. Margaret wasn't affectionate, but she wasn't cruel either. She had a presence that commanded respect, and Daniel quickly realized that she was far from the lonely, desperate woman he had assumed she would be. For the first few days, things were simple. Margaret gave him access to her accounts, and Daniel's bank balance transformed overnight. He cleared his debts, paid off his tuition, and even bought himself a decent suit, something he had never owned before. It felt surreal, like he had cheated life itself. But then, things started to shift. Margaret would disappear for hours at a time, sometimes entire nights. When Daniel asked where she had been, she would only smile and say, "Business." There were no phone calls, no visitors, yet she always seemed to have somewhere important to be. On the 12th night of their marriage, Daniel woke up to find Margaret missing again. He was used to it by now, but something about this night felt different. The air was thick with unease. As he walked through the dimly lit mansion, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors, he noticed something strange. The door to Margaret's study, which was always locked, was slightly open. His heart pounded. Margaret had always been clear about one thing: never enter my study. Daniel hesitated, but curiosity got the better of him. He pushed the door open. Inside, the room was unlike anything he had ever seen. Shelves lined with old, dusty books, walls covered in photographs. But it was the desk that caught his attention. On it, there was a single file with his name on it. Hands trembling, Daniel opened it, and that was the moment everything changed. Daniel's fingers trembled as he flipped open the file. His name was printed in bold letters at the top of the first page. Beneath it, a detailed document laid out everything about his life: his childhood in foster care, his struggles in college, even personal details he had never shared with anyone. Every address he had ever lived at, every job he had worked, every debt he owed. His stomach twisted. This wasn't just a file. It was a report, almost as if someone had been tracking him for years. His pulse pounded in his ears as he turned the pages. Then, his breath caught. Attached to the document was a black and white photograph. A young woman stood in the image, smiling, a woman who looked eerily familiar. Daniel's eyes darted to the bottom of the photograph. A name was written in neat, cursive handwriting: Eleanor Whitmore. Daniel's mind raced. He had heard that name before. Somewhere deep in his memory, it rang like a distant bell. Then it hit him. His mother's name was Eleanor. His legs went weak. He stumbled back, gripping the edge of the desk to steady himself. Margaret had a file on his mother. Why? How? His mother had died when he was a child. He barely had any memories of her, and yet, here she was, in a photograph, looking younger than he had ever seen her. Daniel's breathing turned shallow. He frantically turned another page. There was a letter tucked inside, a handwritten note. If you are reading this, then you were meant to find it. The handwriting was elegant but unfamiliar. Daniel swallowed hard and continued reading. There are things you don't know, Daniel. Things that were kept from you for a reason. Your mother was not who you thought she was, and neither is Margaret. His hands clenched around the paper. The air in the room felt suffocating. Before he could process any of it, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed from the hallway. Margaret. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. He shoved the file shut and stepped back just as the study door creaked open. Margaret stood in the doorway, her blue eyes sharp and knowing. She wasn't surprised to see him here. If anything, she looked amused. You found it, didn't you? Her voice was calm, almost expectant. Daniel struggled to find his words. Who are you? His voice came out hoarse. Margaret took a step inside, closing the door behind her. I was hoping you'd wait a little longer before finding out, she said, her gaze unwavering. But I suppose curiosity runs in the family. Family. The word hit him like a bullet. What are you talking about? Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret sighed, moving toward the desk. She ran a hand over the closed file, almost as if it carried memories she wasn't ready to relive. You've been asking the wrong questions, Daniel. Daniel's mind raced. His entire life, he had believed he was alone, just another kid who had been abandoned by the world. But if Margaret had known his mother, if she had been keeping tabs on him for years... Who were you to my mother? His voice cracked. Margaret finally looked at him, something shifting in her expression, and then she spoke the words that shattered everything he thought he knew. She was my daughter. The room spun. Daniel's knees nearly buckled. No, that's not possible, he whispered. You're lying. Margaret's eyes softened. but there was an unmistakable sadness in them. "I wish I were." Daniel shook his head violently. My mother was an orphan. She had no family. She died alone." His voice broke. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's what you were told." Silence filled the space between them, heavy and suffocating. Daniel's stomach churned. "Why?" He could barely get the word out. "Why didn't you—" Margaret exhaled sharply. "Because she ran from me, Daniel. She didn't want this life. She didn't want me." Daniel's chest ached as he tried to piece everything together. His entire life had been a lie. The woman standing before him wasn't just some stranger he had married for money. She was his grandmother. Daniel felt like the walls were closing in. His body went numb, his ears ringing with Margaret's words. "She was my daughter." It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. His mother had no family. She had told him that. She had struggled, she had suffered, she had died alone. But now, standing in front of him was a woman who claimed to be his grandmother, a woman who had been watching him from the shadows his entire life. Daniel's fists clenched. "You're lying," he said, his voice shaking. "If you were really my grandmother, why didn't you come for me? Why did you let me grow up in foster care, starving, alone?" His throat tightened with rage. Margaret didn't flinch. She met his anger with a quiet, almost sorrowful gaze. "Because your mother didn't want me to." Daniel's breath hitched. Margaret moved slowly, pulling out a chair and sinking into it as if the weight of the past was suddenly too much for her to carry. She gestured toward the chair across from her. "Sit, Daniel." He hesitated. Every instinct in him screamed to run, to get out of this house, away from this woman and the truth she held. But another part of him, the part that had spent his entire life questioning why he had been abandoned, needed answers. His legs felt heavy as he sat down. Margaret studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Your mother was everything to me. Eleanor was my only child. I raised her alone after my husband passed away. She was brilliant, kind, but she was also stubborn. She wanted nothing to do with the life I built for her." Daniel frowned. "What life?" Margaret let out a small, bitter chuckle. "A life of power, of wealth. I wasn't always just a lonely old woman in a mansion, Daniel. I was someone important, someone dangerous." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. "I built my fortune from nothing," Margaret continued, "but money doesn't come without consequences. People feared me, respected me, and your mother, she despised it. She wanted a normal life, a quiet life. She ran from me the moment she turned 18. I searched for her, but she made it clear. She wanted no part of me or my world." Daniel's head spun. His mother had never told him any of this. All she had ever said was that life had been unfair to her, that she had no family, that it had always just been the two of them against the world. Margaret's eyes darkened. "When I finally found her, she had you, a little boy with wide, innocent eyes. I begged her to come home. I promised her I would take care of both of you." She let out a shuddering breath. "But she refused. She said she would rather struggle than let me control her life, and then she disappeared again." Daniel swallowed hard. "And then she died." Margaret's expression grew unreadable. "Yes." A sharp pain stabbed through Daniel's chest. He had always believed his mother had died a poor, struggling woman because she had no one to turn to. But now he knew the truth. She had someone. She had a mother, a wealthy mother, a mother who could have saved her, and she had chosen to die alone instead. Daniel's voice was hoarse when he spoke. "Why now? Why come for me after all these years?" Margaret leaned forward, her piercing blue eyes locking onto his. "Because you are the last piece of her I have left." Silence filled the room. Margaret sighed. "I knew where you were, Daniel. I watched over you, from a distance. I made sure you never truly fell too far. Every job you miraculously got, every scholarship that saved you at the last moment, that was me. Daniel's heart pounded. The coincidences in his life, how he had always just barely scraped by, how opportunities had come at the last second. It had never been luck, it had been her. I didn't step in because I wanted you to make your own choices, Margaret continued. I wanted you to fight for yourself, to grow into a man of your own making. But when I saw you sinking, when I saw you about to lose everything, I couldn't stand by any longer. She exhaled. That's why I put out the ad. Daniel's stomach dropped. You knew it would be me? Margaret gave him a small, sad smile. I hoped it would be. The room felt suffocating. Daniel's entire life had been built on lies, on missing pieces of a puzzle he never even knew existed. His mother had run from wealth, from power, from a mother who had been willing to do anything for her, and she had dragged him along in her escape. A wave of emotions crashed over him. Anger, grief, confusion. What do you want from me? He whispered. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. I want to give you what should have been yours all along. Daniel's blood ran cold. Margaret stood, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. You are my grandson, Daniel, and that means you are the heir to everything I have. Daniel's breath caught. The money, the estate, the legacy, it's yours, Margaret said softly. But with it comes responsibility. This life, it is not easy, but it is powerful. And now, the choice is yours. The room was silent, but Daniel's mind screamed with chaos. For the first time in his life, he had everything he had ever wanted. Wealth, stability, power. But at what cost? Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. His entire life had been a constant battle, fighting for survival, clawing his way through every hardship. And now, with just a few words, Margaret had turned everything upside down. You are my grandson, and the heir to everything I have. He stared at her, searching for any trace of deception, any sign that this was some cruel joke. But Margaret's face was calm, her expression unreadable. A part of him wanted to laugh. How ridiculous it all sounded. Just days ago, he had been a desperate student, willing to do anything for a chance at financial stability. He had married a stranger for her money, and now that stranger was telling him that she was his grandmother, and worse, that she had been watching over him his entire life. Daniel's hands trembled under the weight of it all. So, what happens now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret studied him carefully. That depends on you. A bitter chuckle escaped his lips. Oh, really? I get a choice in all this? Margaret's gaze didn't waver. You always have a choice, Daniel. I never wanted to force you into this life, just as I never forced your mother. Her voice softened. But if you accept what I'm offering, it will change everything for you. Daniel looked down at his hands. He had spent years struggling, working tirelessly, just to afford a meal, a place to sleep. And now, an unimaginable fortune was being placed at his feet. It felt unreal. It felt wrong. He took a shaky breath. And if I walk away? Margaret's lips pressed together. Then you walk away. I won't stop you. I will, however, ensure that you never struggle again. I won't watch my grandson suffer when I have the power to prevent it. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He wasn't used to being wanted. He wasn't used to being protected. But the weight of her offer, of her world, pressed down on him like a mountain. I don't know if I can do this, Daniel admitted, his voice breaking slightly. Margaret nodded, as if she had expected his hesitation. I won't ask you to decide right away, but you do need to understand what this life entails before you make a choice. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Margaret took a deep breath. Being my heir doesn't just mean inheriting money, Daniel. It means inheriting power, influence, and enemies. A chill ran down his spine. Enemies? Margaret stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the vast estate. When you build an empire as large as mine, there are always people who want to take it away. People who would rather see you ruined than see you succeed. She turned back to him. And if you accept my offer, those people will see you as a threat. Daniel's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about money. This was about stepping into a world far beyond anything he had ever known. A world filled with dangers he wasn't prepared for. Margaret's voice was steady. I won't force you to stay, but I need you to understand that walking away from this doesn't mean you walk away from the consequences. His brows furrowed. What consequences? Margaret's jaw tightened. You've already been seen with me. The moment you married me, people started asking questions. If you leave now, without protection, you become vulnerable. There are those who would love to take advantage of you, to use you against me. Daniel's heart pounded. You're saying if I don't stay, I'll still be in danger? Margaret sighed. Not immediate danger, no. But there will always be whispers. There will always be people watching. The air in the room felt heavy. Daniel had spent his entire life fighting to escape poverty. And now, the choice in front of him wasn't as simple as staying rich or staying poor. It was about stepping into a world where wealth came with a cost he wasn't sure he was willing to pay. He looked at Margaret, the woman who had orchestrated everything in his life from behind the scenes. He didn't know whether to thank her or resent her. After a long silence, he spoke. What exactly would I have to do? Margaret smiled faintly, as if she had been waiting for this question. First, you learn. You spend time by my side. You see how this world works, how to navigate it. Daniel hesitated. The idea of being trained, groomed for a life of wealth and power felt foreign, but at the same time, it was tempting. He had spent years feeling powerless. Maybe it was time for that to change. Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder. I know this is a lot, but trust me, Daniel, if you choose this life, you will never have to struggle again. The thought was intoxicating, but was it worth the price? Daniel sat in silence, his mind reeling from everything Margaret had told him. Just 12 days ago, he had been nothing more than a struggling student, willing to make a desperate choice for financial stability. Now he was standing at a crossroads he never could have imagined. One path leading to unimaginable wealth and power, the other to an uncertain future with unseen dangers. He looked at Margaret, the woman who had upended his entire life with a single revelation. His grandmother, his last remaining family. A woman who had built an empire so vast that even walking away from it would not free him from its reach. His hands clenched into fists. If I accept, what happens next? Margaret's eyes softened. Then you begin your training. You will learn everything, how to handle business, how to protect yourself, and most importantly, how to survive in this world. There are people who will try to manipulate you, who will see you as an easy target. I won't let that happen. Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of her words pressing down on him. It wasn't just about money anymore. This was about survival, about stepping into a world of power that would either make him or destroy him. But what if I say no? He asked cautiously. Margaret studied him for a long moment before answering. Then you walk away with enough money to never struggle again. But you will never truly be free, Daniel. You are tied to this name now, whether you like it or not. He swallowed hard. A life of struggle or a life of power. His entire childhood had been a fight for survival. The hunger, the sleepless nights, the constant worry about how he would make it through the next day. And now, for the first time in his life, he had a chance to change everything. Margaret reached into a drawer and pulled out a document. This is the official transfer of inheritance. If you sign this, you become my legal heir." She slid it across the desk toward him. "But this is your decision, and yours alone." Daniel stared at the paper. His name was already written on it. All it needed was his signature. His heart pounded. Was he ready for this? He glanced at Margaret, the woman who had orchestrated everything, who had watched over him from the shadows for years. She had power, influence, but she was also alone. Would he become like her? Would he lose himself in this world of wealth, where trust was rare and enemies lurked in every corner? He took a deep breath, then picked up the pen. His hands trembled as he hovered over the line. Then, he put the pen down. "I need time," he said, his voice firm. Margaret didn't look surprised. Instead, she gave a small nod. "Then take it. But remember, Daniel, this world does not wait. Sooner or later, you will have to choose." Daniel stood, his mind racing. He had walked into this marriage expecting to buy his way into a better life. But now, he had stumbled into something far bigger than he had ever imagined. As he walked out of the room, he realized one thing: his life would never be the same again. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if that was a good thing. This story reminds us that life's greatest opportunities often come at a cost. Daniel set out in search of wealth, only to discover that money alone cannot guarantee happiness or freedom. In the end, true power lies not in fortune, but in the choices we make. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Stories of Hope for more inspiring and thought-provoking stories.